Fantastic. The kids are here. Welcome. Happy New Year.
See, I'm going in for the hug.
Every New Year's, Turner Classic Movies celebrates another full rotation around the sun with the That's Entertainment trilogy, a series of compilation films showcasing musical numbers from MGM's golden age. And almost every year, I've skipped these festivities. I could understand the appeal back when the first film came out in 1974, when the only way to watch these musical numbers was to either catch the films in theatrical re-release or on television. But in an era where I can just search MGM musical numbers on YouTube and be set for an afternoon, I didn't see the point. But for whatever reason, my curiosity got the better of me this year, and I decided to tune in and watch the first That's Entertainment. And what I saw fascinated me. On the surface, That's Entertainment is exactly what I expected, a glitzy musical showcase highlighting the best and most iconic numbers from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's back catalog. Made to celebrate the studio's 50th anniversary and hosted by a series of elderly stars, the film is a tribute to the artistry and unbridled entertainment value of the MGM musical, from the late 1920s and the dawn of the talkies to the close of the 1950s. But there's also a kind of desperation on display, indicators of Hollywood's exhaustion as aging stars wander through the ruins of the old studio system. Praise for the movies shifts from boisterous to insecure, the film proclaiming the MGM musical a grand spectacle that will never be matched, while simultaneously accepting the genre's perceived shallowness.
You know, you can wait around and hope, but I'll tell you, you'll never see the likes of this again. Musicals of the 1930s and 40s, or even the 50s, may not tell you where our heads were at, but they certainly will tell you where our hearts were at.
The films are both venerated for their artistry and excused for their superficiality. It's ironic that TCM shows That's Entertainment as a New Year's tradition, because the film is acutely about the unyielding passage of time, of eras lost and the struggle to reconcile past and future. Posing as celebration, That's Entertainment is really an act of mourning, a lament that the old Hollywood is well and truly gone, and it's never coming back. And in the months since my viewing, I've only continued to be fascinated by That's Entertainment, not so much as a movie than as a historical document. The history it purports to tell is flawed and contradictory, a work of self-mythology that simultaneously undervalues the musicals it showcases. But the real historical value is as a time capsule of an industry and art form at a point of transformation. What does That's Entertainment say, and fail to say, about the movie musical? What does it say about the collapse of the studio system and the new Hollywood which emerged in the 60s and 70s? And what can the film's efforts at historicizing tell us about how we preserve film history today? I'll be discussing all that and more, so strap yourselves in for a deep dive into how a self-aggrandizing clip show turned out to be one of the most unintentionally revealing Hollywood movies ever made. This was entertainment. Before we get into what That's Entertainment is actually doing, we should talk a bit about what it's trying to do. What were the intentions of this showcase of old MGM musicals? The first goal is to offer a history of the MGM musical. The film's structure loosely moves chronologically from the 20s through to the 50s. The introduction even sets up the film as a history lesson, first by chronicling performances of the song Singin' in the Rain across 30 years of MGM films, but also in Frank Sinatra's voiceover.
If you're wondering what happened in between, well, sit back and relax. You're about to find out.
The film is overtly declaring its educational motivations to explain the development of the MGM musical from beginning to end. Does That's Entertainment pull this off? Sort of? Not really. The film does get some basics right, discussing how the musical emerged from the development of sound film and citing MGM's The Broadway Melody and The Hollywood Review in 1929 as major milestones for the genre. The film also highlights that while all the Hollywood studios made musicals, only MGM made it a defining part of their brand.
But when it came to musicals, MGM, they were the champions.
This is also corroborated by the data. According to Thomas Schatz, MGM produced over half of all the musicals in Hollywood from 1946 to 1955, totaling over 25% of MGM's output in this period. And if nothing else, if someone knows literally nothing about musicals, That's Entertainment will at least introduce them to some of the most famous ones ever made and the stars who made them. But it's all a bit broad and simplistic, especially when you consider how selective a history the film is actually laying out. After covering the Broadway melody in the Hollywood Review, Sinatra mentions the musical coming of age within a few short years, as the
primitive stage show had now become a cinematic spectacular.
All while the film shows a truly sumptuous number from the 1937 film Rosalie. What the film doesn't mention is the filmmaker who helped define that cinematic spectacular, Busby Berkeley. While the Broadway melody was content to simply film a stage show and call it a day, Berkeley's song and dance numbers were designed for the screen, the camera capturing angles impossible on the stage, and being invited to participate in the dance. As Janine Basinger notes, a Berkeley number in a film like Gold Diggers of 1933 begins within the reality of the stage before transcending into cinematic fantasy. Also unacknowledged by That's Entertainment are directors Ernst Lubitsch and Ruben Mamoulian, whose films made pivotal steps in integrating musical numbers within the plot of the film. While the Hollywood Review was a plotless collection of musical numbers, Lubitsch and Mamoulian used musical numbers to propel a story. But these guys don't show up in That's Entertainment, because their musical contributions were made elsewhere. Lubitsch and Mamoulian were signed to Paramount, while Berkeley's genre-defining advancements were made at Warner Brothers. And you might argue that's sufficient explanation for their exclusion. This is a tribute to MGM after all. Why should other studios hog some of the limelight? But I don't buy that. These things don't exist in a vacuum. The spectacular finale from Rosalie was responding to Berkeley's numbers, just as the greater integration of music with plot and characters in the sequels to the Broadway melody was responding to Mamoulian's Love Me Tonight and Lubitsch's 1 Hour With You. You cannot accurately tell the history of the MGM musical without also considering the influence of external forces. And on that note, That's Entertainment has a bad habit of conflating the history of the MGM musical with the history of the movie musical, and those are not the same thing. For example, the film describes the Broadway melody as the beginning of a new motion picture art form, suggesting it's the start of musicals on film. A promotional feature for That's Entertainment just says it outright.
The stars you are seeing are all returning to MGM, the studio that invented the movie musical.
This isn't true. Frankly, you could argue movies have been musicals since the silent era, given how essential live music and original orchestrations were to silent film exhibition. But even using the simple definition of a musical as a movie built around the performances of song and dance to tell a story, the movie musical has a clear originary point, and it's not the Broadway melody. It's the jazz singer. Released a year and a half before the Broadway melody, The Jazz Singer is built around the musical persona of established entertainer Al Jolson, and as a showcase for his performances. The primary conflict between the draw of show business and the traditions of Jewish heritage is represented in contrasting musical styles, and is resolved by Jolson successfully performing both. By what definition would we not call this a musical? Because some scenes are still silent? So what? The basic structure of non-musical scenes building the story until it reaches a point that can only be expressed through song is still intact. Also, the Broadway melody still uses title cards for transitions and establishing scenes, so it too still has a foot firmly planted in the traditions of silent cinema. Moreover, I am 100% convinced that if The Jazz Singer had been made at MGM, it would have been included in That's Entertainment. Those editors would have been thrilled to use, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet, to establish the talkie and build hype for the musical spectacle to come. That's not to say the Broadway melody wasn't a milestone. The film did set the template for the backstage musical, a subgenre where the performances on stage are contrasted with the drama and intrigue going on behind the scenes. And the film also focuses much more on chorus lines and ensembles than The Jazz Singer, which is way more concerned with the individual performer. But to call the Broadway Melody the first movie musical is just flagrantly false. Hell, Warner literally released 2 more musicals off the heels of The Jazz Singer before Broadway Melody hit screens. At other times, That's Entertainment doesn't lie exactly, but it does mislead. The film highlights the iconic dance team of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers while showing a number from the Barclays of Broadway. But this isn't actually all that representative of the Astaire-Rogers musicals. Their other films had been made in the 30s, were shot in black and white, and typically started with the pair as strangers who fall in love across a series of seductive dance numbers. The Barclays of Broadway was made in 1949, was shot in color, and deliberately plays off the pair's existing star personas. They begin the film not as strangers, but a husband and wife dance team. Barclays is a good movie, and a rewarding one for those who know they're Astaire and Rogers, but it doesn't look all that much like the rest of the pair's films, and it isn't structured like them. But those movies were made at RKO. The Barclays of Broadway was their only movie as a team for MGM, so it serves as the stand-in for the Astaire-Rogers movie. That's Entertainment's only glimpse of Fred Astaire in the 1930s. In the black and white, donning the iconic top hat, is from Dancing Lady, where Fred dances with his famous partner, Joan Crawford. Honestly, she's not bad, and this was Astaire's first screen role, so it warrants a mention, but it's also indicative of the major gaps and rewriting in That's Entertainment's history. If it didn't happen at MGM, then it didn't happen at all. Where That's Entertainment falters as history, it fares a little better as appreciation. Most of the presenters speak rather lovingly about the musicals highlighted, and the film showcases a good mix of the iconic numbers everyone knows and the more obscure, all blended together in one glowing package. The numbers also just kinda speak for themselves. You let Astaire dance or Judy Garland sing, and the greatness of MGM musicals at their best is frankly self-evident. And it's a good thing that greatness is self-evident, because That's Entertainment's not here to explain it for ya. Stephen Cohen draws attention to a scene where bygone star Peter Lawford talks about the MGM musical having a distinct style, but neither he nor the film explains what that style actually is. There are some shared aesthetics on display in the scenes included: grandeur, beauty, and an emphasis on spectacle, all bolstered still with the addition of color, but we don't get much more than that. How else might we define the MGM musical style? One answer comes from Janine Basinger, who identifies 3 core structuring components in the musicals by MGM producer Arthur Freed, but I'd argue they're more broadly applicable to all MGM musicals. First, musical establishment. People in real life don't burst into song and dance. When and how does a musical first communicate that its characters will? Basinger cites Meet Me in St. Louis as an exemplar of musical establishment. The film begins in the home of the Smith family, and the camera tracks the youngest daughter as she sings the titular song. Her singing is unpolished and the choreography simple, reflecting the absent-minded play of a child, subtly underscored by an orchestra. But as the child comes across her grandfather, he continues the song, his voice and dance moves more refined. And as Grandpa looks to the window, the orchestra begins to swell, and we hear the powerhouse vocals of Judy Garland. With its shifting singers and escalation of skill, the film has seamlessly moved from the ordinariness of a child singing to herself to a fully fledged musical world. The second structuring component is musical integration. How closely linked are the musical numbers to the story and characters? In The Bandwagon, how do the film star Fred Astaire and the ballerina Sid Charisse resolve their differences and begin working together? Why, through dance, of course. The number is so well integrated that to cut it out would leave a gaping hole in the story. And finally, there's musical intervals. How often do musical numbers occur? If the gaps between numbers are too long, the film risks the audience forgetting they're watching a musical, and later numbers become jarring. If the gaps are too short, though, the numbers start to step on each other's toes, and don't allow the audience to savor the music. These structuring devices are essential to the artistry of the MGM musical, not just the technical execution of the numbers themselves, but how they work in tandem within a film. Take a movie like Summer Stock. The film begins with Judy belting out a tune in the shower, a rather brilliant choice. Normal people don't burst into song, of course, except for the times they do, like in the shower, and Judy continues her song into the rest of her morning routine. The opening uses a normal example of a non-singer singing to establish musicality immediately. The song's chorus even justifies the unreality of musicals with this simple instruction.
If you feel like singing, sing, tra-la-la.
And Judy does just that a few minutes later. After some dialogue scenes establishing her struggling farm, her dweeby fiancé, and her desire to save her farm, Judy successfully acquires a tractor to help with her work, and she sings joyously as she drives home. Not only does this respect a healthy distance between numbers, it also coalesces the defining aspects of Judy's character, the farmer and the singer. We can see that Judy cares for her farm, and that she has a song in her heart. She wants to sing, setting up her eventual ascendancy to barnyard musical lead, and laying the foundation for her romance with Gene Kelly, which is driven forward in a series of dance numbers. And these numbers culminate with Get Happy. This isn't the most complexly choreographed or shot of the film's numbers, but you don't need a ton of theatrics when you've got a stylish outfit and powerhouse vocals. It's one of the most iconic numbers of Garland's career, and for good reason. But in That's Entertainment, Get Happy is all Summer Stock is. The film has other numbers worthy of a highlight reel. Kelly's solo with a newspaper and a squeaky floor immediately comes to mind. But the deeper issue is that purely showcasing contextless numbers elides how they work together in tandem with the film, and in doing so, reduces their artistry. And this is also true of the musicals that get a lot of attention in That's Entertainment. Singing in the Rain has no less than 4 performances highlighted, and the presenters talk with deep reverence for the film, calling it possibly the greatest musical ever made and a shining example of Gene Kelly's brilliance. But again, it's those structuring details that get lost. Take how succinctly the film establishes itself as a musical within literal seconds. An audience understands that a credit sequence is non-diegetic, i.e., it doesn't actually happen within the literal world of the film. So the filmmakers don't need to worry about realism. They can just start with music. We're also introduced to our 3 lead characters, the film's optimistic tone, and we also get our first of many references to film history. Cinematically literate viewers might recognize how the presentation of the song evokes its appearance in the Hollywood Review, establishing Singing in the Rain as a movie in dialogue with the early years of the movie musical, which will come to be a pivotal plot point later on. We're even given a preview of a later number, but that payoff is in a different tempo and is a solo, meaning it still feels fresh even if we've been teased with it. And yeah, everyone knows the payoff, the titular Singin' in the Rain. Even if you've never seen the movie, there's a decent chance you've seen this scene, and at the very least, you definitely know about it. But seeing it in context genuinely makes it so much better. Gene Kelly, having just taken Debbie Reynolds home, is now left in the afterglow of their time together, as he realizes he's falling in love. That's the bliss which motivates his Singing in the Rain, and it's one of the most simple and relatable experiences of love. That feeling when you've just finished spending time with your crush and you're already looking forward to seeing them again. Almost no one can move like this, but almost everyone has felt like this. My favorite part of the scene is actually the least spectacular, when Gene is caught by a cop, whose judgmental look brings Kelly back to reality, where people don't burst into song and dance, and he stops. But even here, Kelly can't contain himself. Dancing and singing in the rain. He's happy, and he's not going to apologize for it. These are the details that get smoothed over in That's Entertainment. Indeed, the specificities of the individual films are swallowed into a singular grand design. Some marquee titles stand apart from the mass, Singin' in the Rain, An American in Paris, The Wizard of Oz, but the sheer quantity of films featured becomes difficult to keep track of, especially as That's Entertainment's showcases give way to montages bridging multiple films, collapsing dozens of movies into simply the MGM musical. To its credit, That's Entertainment does take some efforts to counteract this collapsing. Many films are at least named by the presenters, and the credits do include a section naming the lyricists, composers, and vocal coaches who help sculpt the sound of the movies being celebrated. No mention of the directors or choreographers, though, nor are the films themselves actually listed. The result is a kind of homogeneity which blankets over MGM's musical library. And to some extent, this sameness is part and parcel when discussing old Hollywood. There's this idea of the classic studio system as a mechanized factory, creating and recreating a standardized product. Directors in this system were, with some exceptions, anonymous craftsmen fulfilling a role on the factory floor rather than artists. As with a lot of Hollywood truisms, this is an oversimplification, but if any studio was the poster child for this kind of system, it was MGM. Studio head Louis B. Mayer wielded tremendous creative control over the movies MGM produced, the flourishes and creativity of individual directors largely yielding to Mayer's vision of glamour, beauty, and a near utopian ideal of America, which shunned political dissent or social issues. To quote Foster Hirsch, although he never produced a single film, never directed a single shot, or wrote a single line of dialogue, Mayer, in an almost mystical sense, influenced the MGM style, and it was his ideas of truth and beauty that most MGM films promoted. Thomas Schatz elaborates that at MGM, it was not the director's responsibility to orchestrate the entire filmmaking process, from conception and story development through editing to release. That responsibility steadily shifted to the producer. Indeed, workflow at MGM was divided amongst producers, who headed up their own unit which specialized in a specific kind of movie. Musicals at MGM fell primarily to 3 producers: Joe Pasternak, Jack Cummings, and Arthur Freed, far and away the most celebrated. Freed even has a special credit in all 3 That's Entertainment movies, singling him out, but even his work was just another piece of the MGM machinery, all working cohesively together. All that to say, it's not exactly ahistorical to collapse all of the MGM musicals into one unified studio vision, but it does erase the contributions of specific filmmakers. Like, yeah, I couldn't tell you what distinguishes a Charles Walters or a Richard Thorpe musical, but I could tell you what distinguishes a Stanley Donen and a Vincent Minnelli. Donen and Minnelli were the directors behind the bulk of the most beloved MGM musicals, especially in the 40s and 50s, and the men do share a lot. Both made a lot of their musicals with Arthur Freed, both worked with Gene Kelly, particularly Donen, who often co-directed with Kelly, and both represented the creme de la creme of musical directors in the studio era. But their sensibilities were also very different. Minnelli had a much more European flavor, and not just because a lot of his musicals were set in Europe, but also in his refined aesthetic and sense of sophistication. His movies would often draw on ballet and opera, with numbers which push beyond even musical fantasy and into a heightened abstraction. The movies themselves, however joyous, were often marked with a melancholic streak. Donen, on the other hand, was much more of a pop filmmaker, someone who prioritized sheer fun, escapism, and entertainment value. Each director's most celebrated musical, Minnelli's An American in Paris and Donen's Singin' in the Rain, climax on a ballet, but Minnelli's is dripping in the influence of French painters and of international art house hit The Red Shoes. Donen's is an ode to entertainment itself, coded with signifiers of American genre cinema and MGM's own history of musical entertainments. It would be reductive to say Minnelli was the artist and Donen was the entertainer. Minnelli's films are plenty entertaining, and Donen entertained at such a high level it was most certainly an art, but the comparison is useful shorthand in distinguishing the two. A knowing viewer can parse these differences while watching That's Entertainment, but I'm not sure the unknowing viewer is provided enough context. Without that context, Without that attention to the structure of musicals, That's Entertainment fails to convey the depth and artistry of the MGM musical. And you might be thinking, well, sure, but that's also inherent to the format of the compilation film, and surely it's a worthwhile trade-off if we get so many great musical numbers in one place, especially in 1974. And you know, fair enough, I do get that. What I don't get is the decision to show some of those scenes in the wrong aspect ratio. Most scenes are presented correctly, yes, but occasionally the image is blown up from the original squared Academy ratio to fill a wide frame. I can only assume this was done to make the films feel bigger, but lost in the process are the compositions, which now feel arbitrary, and what was once an enchanting spectacle has just become a cluster of bodies. I cannot overstate how much I hate this decision. CinemaScope musicals like Gigi and Seven Brides for Seven Brothers are presented in their original aspect ratio, even though it doesn't fill the entire frame, and the clips selected suggest the filmmakers recognize the importance of those compositions to the artistry. Why is the same courtesy not always extended to musicals in the Academy ratio? If That's Entertainment seeks to showcase MGM's vast musical library, why is it altering the films? Okay, so, if That's Entertainment is fundamentally flawed as both film history and film appreciation, what else might it offer? And the answer is nostalgia, plain and simple. The film is all about luxuriating in the glory days of old. Remember these movies, remember these faces, remember going to see musicals in your youth. All the film's failings suddenly make sense when you consider this framing. It's a bad history lesson because the target audience is already familiar with the movies. It's a bad film appreciation because the object of reminiscence isn't really the films themselves, it's the memories of them, of the old Hollywood. But I have to ask, whose nostalgia are we really talking about here? The fundamental contradiction of That's Entertainment is that it's reminiscing about the good old days in the thick of what was an artistic renaissance for American cinema. The new Hollywood had exploded onto movie screens in the late 60s and ushered in a new decade of cutting-edge American movies. Freed from the constraints of the Hollywood production code, influenced by the aesthetics of international art house cinema, and stewarded by a generation of new filmmakers, the new Hollywood produced a trove of masterpieces, building on the tenets of classic Hollywood while simultaneously reinventing them. It was an era where an art cinema within the industry of Hollywood didn't just exist, it thrived. 1974 was in fact a banner year for the new Hollywood. These 12 months saw the release of Chinatown, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, The Parallax View, Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, A Woman Under the Influence, Phantom of the Paradise, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, The Sugarland Express, Lenny, The Taking of Pelham 123, California Split, Thieves Like Us, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. And there is a part of me that wants to laugh, that in the midst of all this, you've got these old-timers like, well, they don't make them like they used to. They're making them better than ever, Grandpa! What are you talking about? But of course, I'm showing my bias for the kind of violent, morally ambiguous stories the new Hollywood liked to tell, along with my own nostalgia for a bygone era, one I wasn't even alive for. Because the fact is, they really weren't making them like they used to. The industrial system which titans like Louis B. Mayer once presided over had fallen apart. That's Entertainment as nostalgic for that system as the musicals it produced. Which begs yet another question. What happened? How did the studio system go from being the system to being something reminisced about? How did Hollywood become old Hollywood? The studio system is named so because it refers to an era where the vast majority of American filmmaking was controlled by the major Hollywood studios. They produced the films, they distributed them throughout the country, they exhibited them in movie theaters that they owned. Studios didn't just own backlots and sound stages where the movies were made, they owned the people who made movies. They signed contracts with talent which bound them to the studio. Talents like writers, producers, directors, craftspeople, and of course, movie stars.
We were all under contract to MGM in those days, and the studio pretty much told us what pictures we were going to appear in.
Stars were the lifeblood of old Hollywood, with the studios organizing their production and marketing strategies around established star genre formulations. The very identity of a movie studio was inexorably linked to its contracted stars. Studio lots were constantly buzzing with filmmaking at all levels of production, the full machinery of Hollywood optimized for the creation and nourishing of movies. This system solidified in the 1930s and proved exceptionally efficient. Each year, the studios reliably produced dozens and dozens of movies which, in Thomas Schatz's words, were equally successful as commercial commodities, as popular entertainment, and as cinematic art. And within this system, MGM was the gold standard. Their films routinely topped the box office, the Oscars, and the critics' list. They boasted more star power than any other studio. More stars, as the famous expression goes, than there were in the heavens. MGM's deep roster of stars was so well known, they could even brag about it in their musicals.
We've got Garbo and Norma Shearer. We've got Nelson Eddy, lots of others. We've got 3 of the 4 Marx brothers.
Take Judy Garland. Take Catherine Grayson.
Take Mr. Crosby or Fred Astaire.
So bulletproof was MGM that even at the height of the Great Depression, when other studios were declaring bankruptcy, MGM still turned a profit. They were the pinnacle in a system as refined and lucrative as the Model T assembly line. But things rapidly began to change in the post-war years. The causes for the studio system's collapse are complex and multifaceted, but 2 factors in particular stand out. First, the intervention of the federal government. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that the major studios' control over the production, distribution, and exhibition of motion pictures amounted to a monopoly of the film industry and a violation of antitrust laws. The studios were forced to divest in movie theater chains, cutting into a major source of revenue and their financial assets, while also culling their control of the industry. The second factor was television. The advent of moving images broadcast into people's homes directly cut into the audience for cinema. As TV sets became a standard of the American home throughout the 1950s, theater attendance plummeted. Why go out and pay for a movie when you could just stay home and watch the tube? These are both seismic changes that fundamentally transformed the film industry. Revenues fell, studio heads were ousted, contracts were terminated, and the studios gradually shifted from creating films wholesale to primarily providing distribution and financing. Despite this, it wasn't immediately clear that the death knell had been sounded for the MGM musical. The genre was the studio's trademark after all, and musicals also seemed a perfect antidote to the lure of television. The film industry's greatest weapon against TV was the ability to provide a lavish, big-screen spectacle that an 8-inch black and white transistor couldn't hope to duplicate. Musicals, especially those at MGM, where glamour reigned supreme, would seem the optimal spectacular alternative to small-screen thrills at home. And for a time, they were. MGM began the 1950s with a string of highly acclaimed and high-grossing musicals, which seemingly declared the MGM musical stronger than ever. But even these peaks could not keep up with the industrial hemorrhaging. The thing about musicals is that they're very expensive to make, and I don't just mean because of the production value MGM poured into them. I mean the genre is inherently and uniquely labor-intensive. Beyond the usual talents you need to make any Hollywood movie, you also need songwriters, choreographers, lyricists, composers, orchestra members, costume designers, and not just any costume designers, but costume designers specialized specifically in designing costumes that can withstand the wear and tear of musicals, vocal coaches, arrangers, and not just movie stars, not just figures that have that indistinguishable it quality that draws the audience in and turns them into beyond being humans and into gods of the screen. They also need to be able to sing and dance.
I could plainly see she was flirting with me, and my heart was filled with hope.
Or, at the very least, fake it well enough for the cameras. At the height of the studio system, MGM had all these talent and more under contract, and could organize them accordingly. When that system declined and those contracts disappeared, so too did the infrastructure for making musicals. MGM kept making musicals, of course, including successful and innovative ones, but all the same, production was slowing as core talents gradually left the studio. Judy Garland would make her masterpiece, A Star Is Born, at Warner Brothers. Stanley Donen and Fred Astaire began production of Funny Face at MGM, but completed the film with Paramount. In 1953, MGM released 10 musicals. Between 1954 and 1960, the studio averaged less than 4 musicals a year, with just 1 musical each in 1959 and 1960. The 1960 film is Bells Are Ringing, the last musical from the acclaimed Arthur Freed unit, the last Vincent Minnelli-directed musical for MGM, and functionally, the final bow for the MGM musical that the Broadway Melody established in 1929. And just as the MGM musical was winding down, a new style of musical was pointing to the genre's future. From the mid to late 1950s, a series of high-budget Rodgers and Hammerstein adaptations raked in a ton of cash and set a new template for musicals that would dominate in the 1960s. Expensive adaptations of hit Broadway shows presented in the roadshow format, with overtures, intermissions, and epic runtimes. MGM's bread and butter were light and original musicals written specifically for the screen. They also made their share of adaptations, but typically these were either turning non-musical films into musicals or adapting classic shows. And when MGM did adapt Broadway shows in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they typically altered the source material substantially. These roadshow adaptations were different. These were adaptations of contemporary Broadway hits, which rode that name recognition and pre-existing popularity to high box office returns. In other words, they were already proven intellectual property and therefore a safer investment. The more things change. Of course, that investment would eventually bite Hollywood in the ass, as the industry continued to pour money into increasingly costly epics, eventually resulting in high-profile flops like Hello Dolly and Paint Your Wagon at the end of the 60s, all while film critics like Pauline Kael yearned for the pleasures of the lighter and freer musicals of what was then old Hollywood. But at that point, MGM was a shadow of its former self. Louis B. Mayer had been fired in 1951. His replacement, Dor Sherry, was fired 5 years later, which in turn started a revolving door of studio heads. Despite the chaos, MGM did manage to close out the 1950s with back-to-back Best Picture winning hits in the Freed-produced Gigi and the biblical epic Ben-Hur. But those successes failed to stop MGM's dwindling productions. The studio did continue to make movies in the 1960s, even a few musicals, but their biggest and most successful films barely resembled MGM. To paraphrase Foster Hirsch, these films weren't made by contracted MGM stars or filmmakers, and in some cases, they weren't consistent with the aesthetics and values the MGM of old had cultivated. They were made on a piecemeal basis, by filmmakers who used MGM for little more than financing and distribution. It's ironic that in 1968, MGM briefly experimented with a new logo, replacing the iconic Leo the Lion with this more modern and minimalist design. This logo was only used for 2 films and would probably be completely forgotten if one of those films wasn't 2001: A Space Odyssey. Honestly, that was fortunate for the film. I cannot imagine Leo's triumphant roar preceding Kubrick's journey beyond the infinite. Although, little known fact, Hal did make his screen debut in Singin' in the Rain.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Broadway rhythm, it's got me, everybody dance.
Anyway, I don't want to overanalyze a studio logo, but I do think this temporary shift to a more stylish and modern design is indicative of the crisis in identity MGM was experiencing in the new Hollywood. What even is MGM anymore? Which brings us back to 1974, and that's entertainment. The nostalgia the film luxuriates in isn't strictly for the audience, it's for the filmmakers, and for the studio itself, a retreat into MGM's glorious past, when they were still on top of the world. And on the one hand, it is a little awe-inspiring. MGM really did produce a legendary body of work, and no one can ever take that away from them. But on the other hand, it's also a little bit pathetic. It's one thing to be proud of your past, it's another thing to retreat into it, like the middle-aged man always bragging about when he was captain of the high school football team. That's Entertainment is this parade of elderly film stars touring the decaying remnants of MGM's backlot, both visibly aged by the ravages of time, and wistfully remembering how good they used to have it, all while steadfastly refusing to acknowledge the present. The few mentions of contemporary Hollywood are slight. Sinatra says it would be impossible to make the MGM musical today, and Bing Crosby mentions that modern movies prefer to shoot on location rather than on backlots. But otherwise, 70s Hollywood is just kind of vaguely alluded to. The strongest presence it has in the film is Liza Minnelli, who does mention her generation as distinct from the old, but functionally, her role here is as Judy Garland's daughter rather than as a star in her own right. That's Entertainment does not want to talk about the new Hollywood. And that makes sense, because the new Hollywood didn't have a place for the MGM musical. That's not to say there wasn't a place for musicals in New Hollywood. Basinger described the 60s and 70s as transitional years for the musical, with a range of experimentation, from films trying to meld the New Hollywood aesthetics with the musical, to cult films, to films trying to continue the success of lavish Broadway adaptations, along with all manner of strange one-off oddities. The musical was no longer a staple of Hollywood, but it was still a vital component of the American cinema, one which produced several valuable films. There was space for the musical in New Hollywood, just not the kind of musicals MGM made. MGM was the epitome of old Hollywood as a dream factory, and their musicals the epitome of escapist entertainment. These were apolitical romantic fantasies, soaked in glamour, beauty, and feel-good sentiment. Conversely, the New Hollywood musical could broadly be divided into two categories. First, the musicals which embrace the darkness and realism of New Hollywood. These films had a more realist aesthetic, more graphic portrayals of violence and sexuality, and overt political critique. Fiddler on the Roof and Cabaret, the two highest-grossing musicals of the early 70s by a wide margin, both end with entrenching tyranny and violence, along with the gnawing tension that said violence is really just the beginning. On the other end of the spectrum are musicals like Phantom of the Paradise and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, movies that did embrace the artifice of musicals and a kind of spectacle, but a much dingier B-movie spectacle rather than MGM's opulence. They are also pure entertainments in a way Cabaret or even Fiddler weren't, but they were still explicitly violent and perverse. And what's more, these films had rather overt camp and queer overtones baked into virtually every element. That's not to say you can't find camp in MGM's musicals too. Stephen Cohen found so much he wrote a whole book about it. But that was all subtext. Those movies were intended as mass entertainments and promoted a heterosexual, monogamous, and wholesome worldview. You couldn't say the same thing about Rocky Horror. The movies that came the closest to capturing that old MGM magic were Martin Scorsese's New York, New York and Francis Ford Coppola's One from the Heart. And while artistically quite admirable, both of these films also combine that glamour with harsh looks into dysfunctional relationships, which diffuse the film's romanticism. And both films were also massive flops. And even if audiences hadn't soured on the happy musical, MGM wouldn't have been in a position to capitalize anyway. By the 1970s, they'd lost a lot more than their musical division. In 1969, MGM was purchased by real estate mogul Kirk Kerkorian, who leveraged MGM's assets to open the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas, itself furnished with the iconography of the studio's past. The company reoriented itself as a Las Vegas enterprise first and foremost, with filmmaking a distant second priority. That's Entertainment was one of just 4 movies MGM distributed in 1974, and I'm fairly confident that no one watching this video has even heard of the other 3. To be clear, all of the studios struggled as the studio system collapsed, and those that survived all would eventually be acquired by major conglomerates in the 60s and 70s to varying degrees of success. But Warner's, Paramount, Fox, even Universal and Columbia all managed to adapt to New Hollywood and continue making successful movies. Paramount especially was on fire in 1974, producing 3 of the 5 Best Picture nominees, 3 of the top 10 highest grossers, and also The Parallax View. They may not have been the juggernauts of old Hollywood, nor did they possess the same core identity, but the studios of old continued to move into the future. Except MGM, who were barely in the business of making movies. A 1975 promotional feature previewing upcoming MGM releases gives a vivid sense of how the studio was doing in New Hollywood. Titled The Lion Roars Again, the short is clearly meant to herald the triumphant return of the once legendary studio, roaring back onto American screens. But look at the films previewed. That's Entertainment Part 2, which we'll talk about in more detail later, but an inherently backwards-looking project. The Sunshine Boys, the story of 2 aging vaudeville stars played by Walter Matthau and George Burns, so again, backwards looking, and a handful of genre movies, most notably Logan's Run. And I'm not going to tell you these movies are bad. I like Logan's Run, but it's hardly an auspicious lineup. 4 years later, Kerkorian announced MGM was a hotel company and shifted all film production to United Artists. MGM the Casino and MGM the Film Company would eventually be split into separate entities, but their shared legacy is still evident in the halls of the MGM Grand and the roaring lion in a seemingly unending series of ads for online gambling. In Stephen Cohen's words, MGM was reduced to just the famous logo. That's Entertainment is a desperate attempt to cling on to past glory, and it's also indicative of the pilfering of MGM's library in the Kerkorian era, whether it was a casino, a coffee table book, or a compilation film. All sold the same nostalgia. And while that nostalgia was largely self-serving, there was also an audience for it. That's Entertainment was a hit. Based on Box Office Mojo, it did about as well as Chinatown. And I don't think that nostalgia was strictly for old school musicals. That same year, Stanley Donen returned to the genre with A Little Prince, and it landed in theaters with a hollow thud. Rather, the nostalgia was for an imagined better time, when the movies were more wholesome and things seemed simpler. You can detect that attitude in a lot of contemporary writing, in critics who bemoan the cavalier attitudes to violence and lack of overt moralization in New Hollywood cinema, and in others celebrating the clean-cut morals of the 70s disaster films precisely because they rejected the ambiguity and politics of New Hollywood. Indeed, alongside all the New Hollywood movies nominated for Best Picture in 1974, there's also The Towering Inferno, a big-budget, simplistic epic, packed with stars young and old, including That's Entertainment presenter Fred Astaire, and eschewing any kind of prescient political critique or amoral character study. Just famous faces and glossy spectacle. It's not exactly like the MGM musicals of old, but it's informed by a similar ethos of unchallenging, expensive entertainment. And you can see that good old days attitude overtly in That's Entertainment. Like, the presenters flat out say it.
Those sure were the good old days.
Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy sings a song and gets girl. The plots were that simple.
What wonderful years those were at MGM.
You know, you can wait around and hope, but I'll tell you, you'll never see the likes of this again.
In this light, That's Entertainment serves as an antidote to the New Hollywood and its dreary stories of alienation, paranoia, and disappointment.
We blew it.
The tagline spells it out. That's Entertainment. Boy, do we need it now. I talked earlier about the old, rotting MGM sets as reflective of the passage of time and analogous to the aging stars, but another way to read it is as a symbol for the rot afflicting Hollywood, that the once clean-cut, family entertainments had given way to degeneracy, sadism, and sorrow. You might scoff at that reading, and yeah, it is a little pearl clutchy. You know, it seems today that all you see, violence in movies and sex on TV, but where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? Luckily, there's an MGM guy! But then again, I think about the intro to That's Entertainment. We're shown various performances of Singin' in the Rain. First from the Hollywood Review, then in Speakeasily, then Little Nellie Kelly, and finally, the eponymous movie we all know and love. You know what version the film doesn't show?
I'm singing in the road, just singing in the road.
The version Alex DeLarge sings while committing a violent assault in A Clockwork Orange. And the reason for the omission is obvious. That's a Warner Brothers movie. But also, the song is an ironic mockery, twisting romance and good sentiment into sadistic cruelty. The song also returns in Clockwork's credits, this time performed by Gene Kelly himself. The immediate implication is that Alex has returned to his ultra-violent ways, but the reprise is also a kind of Ludovico treatment for the audience. Just as Alex was conditioned to associate Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with revulsion, so too does the audience with Singin' in the Rain. That song is now forever stained. So the notion that something innocent had been tarnished and made to rot is not entirely baseless. And that makes me think of something else. I've quoted Janine Basinger's The Movie Musical a lot in this video, and one point she makes in her introduction has really stuck with me. The movie musical is an original American art form, one which grew out of the traditions of vaudeville and Broadway and into a defining genre of classical Hollywood cinema. Musicals are littered in images of Americana and patriotism. Its subjects have frequently intersected with major milestones in American history. The first movie musical story is about an immigrant finding balance between his dreams and the traditions of his people. And since then, the genre has consistently explored the tension between following your dreams and the harsh economic realities of doing so. That's not a uniquely American experience, that's true of anywhere with a high cost of living, but it is a potently American experience. The movie musical is an American art form. So what does the MGM musical say about America? There's certainly a range in how MGM portrayed America in its musicals, from a glamorous, never-ending vacation to an innocent suburb to a bustling city. But if you were to distill it to a single sentence, the MGM musical says that America is a safe place. Whether it's a port in New York, a farm in Kansas, or a boys' college in the West, you could rest your head easy. That's not to say there wasn't ever conflict, or disappointment, or even deep sadness. There was, but nothing that couldn't be resolved. Even when things looked bad, you knew it'd be okay. Friends and lovers always reconciled their differences. Money troubles always worked themselves out. The show would eventually go on without a hitch. Even when a father is going broke and fears how he'll take care of his family, he does so in a massive house. America wasn't quite perfect, but it was home, and there's no place like home. The America of the new Hollywood was not a safe place. Whether you were in the sticks or the city, you were in danger. Power was wielded by the corrupt, who committed all manner of evil without receiving an ounce of recompense. You can try to fight that evil, but you're just gonna lose anyway. You might instead want to escape, into art, into putting on a show, but you'll only be destroyed. If not by an exploitative industry, then by an insatiable audience. And if they somehow don't get you, your own demons will. There's no place like home, but maybe home isn't enough. The appeal of the MGM version is self-evident, especially in the context of the mid-70s and a nation reeling from the shame of Vietnam and the scandal of Watergate. It's nice to believe in a better time, and That's Entertainment paints a vivid picture of one. But it never really existed either. the times the MGM musical was made in were just as tumultuous as those which birthed the new Hollywood. These movies were made in the shadow of a depression, a world war, a cold war, a Red Scare, and the possibility of nuclear annihilation, to say nothing of systemic racism, sexism, and queerphobia. By no means was America any kind of utopia, no matter what Louis B. Mayer wanted to say in his movies. For that matter, MGM wasn't a utopia either. And I don't mean because of the struggles they experienced post-war, I mean because of their behavior during their so-called glory days. The studio system was not a dream factory, it was ruthless, and MGM was no stranger to bullying or abuse. One needs only a cursory glance at Judy Garland's treatment by MGM. Allegedly groped by Mayer during an audition when she was still a teenager, forced into an incredibly unhealthy diet to control her figure and mocked for her appearance, and alongside co-star Mickey Rooney, fed a steady stream of amphetamines to get through long shooting days, and barbiturates to get to sleep at the end of those days. Garland would develop a lifelong drug addiction and consistent physical and mental health problems. And these weren't deep dark secrets only exposed decades later. With the exception of the groping allegation, this was all public knowledge. Judy's strict diet at MGM was reported to the press as early as 1939. Her drug addiction and career setbacks were the inspiration for a best-selling novel in the 1960s. Her bouts of depression, mental breakdown, and suicide attempts are all well documented. And I honestly feel a little bit silly summarizing any of this. Judy Garland's abuse at MGM's hands is well known. It's as integral a part of her lore as her great performances or her towering musical ability. And while the MGM musical did its best to keep these horrors off screen, cracks slipped through all the time, including mocking Judy's weight to her face.
I watch my weight very carefully.
Sometimes these cracks were subtle, like the reoccurring military iconography, a reminder of America as a warring nation and the many global conflicts it was involved with. Other times, it's more overt, like the hideous instances of blackface which stain so many classic musicals, a stark indicator of how commonplace grotesque racism was in even recent history. These cracks would grow into fissures in the 1950s, with a trio of musicals that started to peel away at the utopia MGM had constructed. First was Brigadoon in 1954, a Vincent Minnelli film where Gene Kelly visits Scotland and discovers an enchanted village which only appears for one day every 100 years. Kelly must then choose between his fiancée in New York or a new love in the village. Most of the film is beautiful and romantic in ways generally consistent with the traditions of the genre. But then you get to the end, where Kelly returns to New York. And it's awful. It's noisy, it's chaotic, it's fundamentally unsatisfying. The only way for Kelly to be happy is to leave, is to take a chance on somewhere else. It's a complete rebuttal of the no place like home ethos of The Wizard of Oz and Minnelli's own Meet Me in St. Louis. A year later, MGM released Love Me or Leave Me, a biopic of 1920s and 30s singer Ruth Etting, primarily centered on her abusive relationship with mobster Martin Snyder. The material is explicitly darker and more violent than the MGM musical typically was, but more noteworthy still is the film's cynical outlook. Ruth isn't seduced by Snyder. She knows exactly what he is and knows his power can propel her career. By film's end, their romance has completely deteriorated into violence and betrayal, but they maintain a professional relationship, because that's show business. It's not just about moxie or heart or putting on a good show. Success is about who has power and what you're willing to give to get it. Finally, we come to 1956 and the big one. On the surface, It's Always Fair Weather looks like any other MGM musical. It's another Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen team-up, with a premise reminiscent of their 1949 hit On the Town. Three GIs and best friends share drinks in a New York bar and vow to meet there again in 10 years' time. Servicemen buddies have a night out in New York. You look at that poster and think, right, this should be a fun time. another gigantic and joyous musical from MGM. But when the men reunite a decade later, they quickly realize they don't actually like each other anymore and regret coming in the first place. What's more, all the dreams they had for themselves as young men have withered away. They've compromised their morals, failed to realize their artistic ambitions, and their personal lives are in disarray. There's still lots of great dancing and catchy tunes, but underneath the glamour is the gnawing feeling that the American dream is soured. And perhaps worse yet, maybe the life these men were sold, the 9-to-5 to support the family, isn't actually fulfilling. One of the film's most formally innovative moments, a split-screen musical number where the three leads sing together yet still separately, is explicitly about how their dreams have not come true.
Gone is that dream up in smoke.
But the best indicator of how different It's Always Fair Weather is from other MGM musicals is I Like Myself. Similar to Singin' in the Rain, this number sees Kelly expressing the joy of falling in love through song and dance. But where Singin' in the Rain was utterly carefree, I Like Myself is wounded and vulnerable. Kelly, who spends a huge chunk of the song singing about how much he hates himself, is shocked to feel happiness, and also reveals said happiness is contingent.
She likes me so, I like myself.
The movie technically has a happy ending. One couple forms, another reconciles, and the bad guys are defeated. But the deeper problems these men have aren't resolved. They have at least grown enough that they're better equipped to face those problems, but they will do so alone. Where so many other MGM musicals ended with everyone being best friends, It's Always Fair Weather ends with all three men going their separate ways, presumably to never see each other again. No clips from any of these films make it into That's Entertainment, though they do all appear in the sequels. But the first film is all about preserving that good old days framing of the past. But despite the best efforts, the mask still slips. Like when Mickey Rooney quips that he doesn't know where he and Judy Garland got the energy to shoot all those musicals.
Where we got all that energy, I'll never know.
A truly deranged line given the drugs MGM pushed on both. On that note, Judy Garland haunts That's Entertainment. More of her movies appear than any other star. She has her own dedicated section, but she also appears throughout the film, including literally the first thing we hear. That's Entertainment begins with a medley of famous tunes from MGM musicals, the first of which being the Trolley Song and Over the Rainbow. Her body of work is integral to MGM's musical library, and That's Entertainment touts that work with pride. And at no point does the film mention Judy's death 5 years earlier. An accidental overdose on barbiturates, the same depressants MGM had given her as a teenager. The assemblage of footage from Judy's films is, on the one hand, a moving tribute to an icon, a celebration of great work that should be celebrated. But it's also kind of grotesque, a dodge of culpability, a means of contorting MGM's volatile and often abusive history with Judy Garland into a sugary love story of beautiful music and images. The violence behind those images may not be acknowledged, but it's palpable all the same. And I find myself coming back to the MGM backlot, our glimpses of the iconic sets and stages left to rot and disarray. Their symbolism is not just of age, nor of the affliction of New Hollywood, but a revelation of the rot which has always existed under the surface of the MGM musical. The good old days That's Entertainment yearns for were always a fantasy, always pretend. In Bing Crosby's words,
Kind of an illusion on an illusion.
And maybe that was always obvious. I certainly don't think old Hollywood audiences passively bought into MGM's utopian vision as being literally true, so much as they found it a pleasurable fantasy to indulge in. But what's fascinating about That's Entertainment is how it's constantly forcing the viewer to confront the breakdown of that fantasy. The extravagant imagery and the warm reminiscence of the presenters paints a glowing portrait of Hollywood movie magic, only to be contrasted with images of decay. Gene Kelly describes how the New York street set was the busiest on the lot as he walks through a ghost town. Audio from the glorious musicals of old fills the speakers, while the camera captures the dwindling remains of abandoned sets. That's Entertainment would turn out to be the final word for the old MGM backlot. After filming was complete, the land was sold and the sets bulldozed. No feature film was ever shot there again. That's Entertainment concludes with the climactic ballet from An American in Paris.
But the ballet from that film is as timeless as the day you and I first saw it. It can only be described as MGM's masterpiece.
Personally, I think the Broadway ballet from Singin' in the Rain would have been better. It's from MGM's most beloved musical, its music and imagery call back to the first MGM musical, and its spirit of entertainment for entertainment's sake is more representative of the MGM musical than An American in Paris's high art ambitions. But I also get it. For one, while Singin' in the Rain's reputation as the best movie musical had already solidified by 1974, the gap between it and An American in Paris wasn't quite as vast then as it is now. Paris was also a Best Picture winner, and its finale is the most forceful statement of the MGM musical as capital A art. Moreover, this is just a very MGM ending. When it comes time for the MGM musical to take its final bow, the choice is not Bells Are Ringing, Arthur Freed and Vincent Minnelli's final musical for the studio and only a modest success, nor is it the preceding musical Gigi, the last great hurrah for MGM's musical division. No, That's Entertainment ends with An American in Paris, not just an expression of the MGM musical at its artistic and commercial best, but also a moment when it seemed eternal, when it still had some of its most beloved films ahead of them rather than behind. Why face the gradual collapse of the MGM musical when you can live in its glory days forever? The end. But of course, it's not really the end because That's Entertainment spawned 2 sequels. That's Entertainment Part 2 hit theaters just 2 years later and proved that even compilation films aren't immune to cash grab quickie sequels. Hosted by Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire, the film ditches the historical format of the first movie and is structured more like a review, a series of numbers from old MGM musicals interspersed with some light banter from the hosts. And it's not just musical numbers, we also get comedy scenes from the MGM library, and eventually just montages of various MGM stars across genres. Robert Osborne described the film as having a more stream of conscious style, which I think is a nice way of saying the film is a complete fucking mess. It's just a hodgepodge of MGM stuff, without rhyme or reason. Even the musical numbers are assembled poorly. The film jumps from the baby number from the bandwagon, which I personally find horrifying but I think is trying to be funny, but it goes from that to Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas at its most melancholic and devastating peak, to some jubilant Astaire dancing in Easter Parade.
Oh no, my brain.
It's a maddening watch. The lone highlight is the host segments, where we get to see Kelly and Astaire dance together one last time. That's Entertainment 3 wouldn't come until 1994, the 70th anniversary year for MGM, or at least what was left of it. And shockingly, it's the best film in the series. Directors Bud Friedkin and Michael J. Sheridan had worked as editors on the previous films, and that experience comes through. Entertainment 3 is focused solely on musicals and is well structured. The film also functions as a legitimate documentary. You actually learn a bit about how musicals are shot, how the star system operated. Lena Horne even talks about the racism she faced as a black star in old Hollywood. Most revealingly, the film includes numbers that had been cut from old MGM musicals and replaced or altered. In some cases, we actually get to see the original placed directly beside the number that replaced it. The overall tone is still very reverential and light, but the resulting film is more substantial. It's appropriate the film was made in association with Turner Entertainment, because the style is very reminiscent of TCM, a celebration of movies, but with legitimate educational value, and even space for criticism. And that touches on a question all 3 That's Entertainment films are trying to address. How do we preserve the history of film? I don't just mean literal film preservation, I mean how are films and film history made available to the public. I started this video by asking why I'd bother with the That's Entertainment movies when I could just watch a bunch of clips on YouTube. But of course, the question of access isn't that simple. A pile of random uploads, ranging from pristine HD clips to fuzzy low-res videos scattered to the winds by YouTube's algorithm, is hardly ideal. In terms of full features, the movies are hardly lost. Of the 100 musicals featured throughout the That's Entertainment trilogy, 49 are available on Blu-ray, 77 are available as digital rentals, and a whopping 95 are on DVD. MGM's musicals have been subject to rather lofty and high-quality home video releases, in fact. But then again, how many of those discs are still in circulation, especially as physical media sellers have dwindled? How much of the general public can watch DVDs at all, given disc drives have become an increasingly optional accessory for electronics? Streaming is the dominant mode of film watching, so what are the streaming options like? Well, in Canada at least, Netflix doesn't have a single movie made before the 1960s, so that's not great. Instead, you boot up Amazon Prime, you navigate to the MGM Plus sub-app, and then curse the heavens because Warner Brothers actually has the rights to MGM's film library up to 1986. Warner's streamer, HBO Max, and its Canadian equivalent Crave have The Wizard of Oz and Singin' in the Rain, the two MGM musicals literally everybody knows, and that's it. And again, the other movies are not lost. They are very available for those who know what they're looking for. But that is also the rub. How are these movies kept alive in the public eye? Once upon a time, the That's Entertainment movies tried to keep them there. Don't get me wrong, I stand by every criticism I've levied against this trilogy, but their efforts to preserve film history are admirable, even with their flaws. And that memory of the MGM musical is at the core of That's Entertainment 3's ending. Instead of showcasing the glory years, the movie ends with Gigi, some parting words from Gene Kelly, now in his 80s, and a montage summarizing the history. And it still has that MGM gloss. Gigi is still a final triumph for the MGM musical rather than its true end, and Kelly is still reminiscing about how things used to be simpler back in the good old days. MGM's gonna MGM. But even so, it's a moving conclusion to the film celebrated, and to the That's Entertainment trilogy. Where the first film was boisterous yet insecure, and the second movie desperately tried to keep the party going, That's Entertainment 3 has accepted that old Hollywood is over, and made peace with that fact. There's some sadness, but also solace, in the memories, and the miles and
miles of film. In the words of Irving Berlin, the song is ended, but the melody lingers on.
It's not a mourning, it's a celebration, and a worthwhile one. The America of MGM's musicals may never have existed, but the MGM musicals did, and they should not be forgotten.